Thank you all for joining us. A couple of weeks ago, I was talking to one of our local CEOs in Forsyth County, and he has a manufacturing plant. He produces these gigantic billboards, advertising boards that you think of, I think of when I see Times Square in New York. And he was talking about, they're beginning to bring their staff back and get geared up. And, he was having some logistic issues. And so he started telling me about what was going on. And, was very much concerned about the logistics and the breaking of the supply chain, back in March when we first started talking about quarantine. And I just made the assumption that there's a lot of manufacturers out there that's having this issue, and maybe it's not an issue, but it's a concern. So I thought it would be a great opportunity to have the conversation, because as we gear up, what we're trying to do is take away a lot of the fear and especially counteract some of the assumptions that's just incorrect. And so what better way of doing it is to bring experts in from the logistics field. And so I want to thank Matt Markham, John Petrino, and Ed Crowell. We're going to bring John and Ed into the conversation a little bit later. For those of you that are muted, when we have more than 12 people, we've learned that it's very difficult to have a conversation with more than 12 people. What we want to do is do the Q&A at the end, and with 12 people, what I'm going to ask you to do is use the chat feature, and if you move your mouse around, there'll be some icons that'll drop down from the right-hand side, and you just click on the chat. During the presentation, put your question there. At the end of it, when we hit to the Q&A slide, I will read those questions out to the guys. So would love to have this to be more interactive, but we do have a presentation from all three of them. So Matt, you're up. You're the first speaker. So
all right. Well, thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity to be here. Thank you, Scott. Thank you, John and Ed. It's always good to be with you guys. Let me briefly, I guess there's a slide there of who I am, but let me tell you just briefly about our center and who we are, and then kind of move into a couple of slides I have just with a little bit of overview. So the Center of Innovation for Logistics, we're part of the Georgia Department of Economic Development. And we work primarily with existing companies. My center is specifically around logistics, supply chain and transportation. We also have counterparts in manufacturing, aerospace, energy, and IT. So we do serve key industries in the state. And we work with companies throughout the state to help them connect to resources, solve problems, and also try to just be a sort of a voice of the industry of logistics throughout the state. So really trying to help make sure companies have what they need to be successful. The state of Georgia knows what it needs to do in order to continue to provide the type of environment that helps our state grow. Just to kind of give a little bit of I wanted to provide a little bit of a baseline about the industry in Georgia. This is based on an economic impact study that we partnered with the University of Georgia with. It came out last fall. The numbers are from 2018. This is the most recent data that we had when we put out in the fall. And you can see that logistics is a key part of Georgia's economy. 181,000 direct jobs, 15,000 private sector establishments, 60 billion in economic output. And one that's a key factor is that 1 in every 14 jobs in the state, about 362,000 jobs, owes its existence to the logistics industry. So it's a key factor. Just to kind of put those numbers in perspective, as it relates to agriculture, which is generally considered to be the #1 industry in Georgia, that number of economic output is 73 billion. And they have an employment factor of 392,000 jobs. So when you compare it to that, you see that it's a very large component of the industry, the state's economy. So not surprisingly, when it comes to private sector logistics employment, transportation is the largest part of that employment by far, followed by which continues to grow in the state. So, I mean, obviously these are kind of a baseline. The economy has taken a pretty big hit recently because of the COVID-19 crisis and response. And so, unemployment rate in Georgia right now last month was 11.9%. So the economy has taken a little bit of a hit now, but the fundamentals of the state as it relates to logistics have always been very strong. And so we're excited and hope for the opportunity that it will all bounce back as we work to reopen, and logistics will continue to be a big part of our state's economy. If you want to flip to the next slide, because of that reduction in employment, obviously that's led to a reduction in traffic in Georgia and movement of vehicles on the road and transportation. This is information that was recently released by GDOT. The GDOT commissioner relayed this information, and that picture is the downtown connector. I think this was like late March or early April, at kind of the worst of the shutdown. When the morning rush hour, you can see there's just no cars on the road in morning rush hour, and that's a big decrease in traffic, 40 to 50% decrease in car traffic. At the peak, it's still down about 20%. As far as truck traffic goes, and I'm sure Ed has an additional, more detailed insight he can talk about with this, but just at a high level, the DOT had reported that truck traffic actually increased a little bit, early on. And the response is trucks were working to make sure to replenish grocery stores and essential goods and things like that. There was an increase in traffic as cars were dropping, and then decreased about 10 to 20% at its worst, and is now back to at or normal above previous years. So freight does continue to move in Georgia. Car traffic is still down. Freight is still moving. One way to look at the impacts is from just the cars on the road, and another way to look at it is in actual miles driven. And based on the Atlanta Regional Commission, which is this Atlanta region's planning agency, Georgia vehicle travel in total miles is estimated to be down almost 60% since March. So people are driving; they're driving less, they're driving fewer miles. And why this is important from a logistics standpoint is, there's a major public sector component to making sure that logistics is smooth in Georgia, and that is the investments that the state makes in transportation infrastructure, whether it's on our highways, our ports, our airport, and rail, making sure that we have those investments that are key to keeping commerce flowing and making sure that our state's attractive to businesses that are looking to locate or expand here and grow their business. And that infrastructure investment is largely made from motor fuel tax funds. And so when fewer cars are on the road, that's fewer people buying gas. Fewer gas leads to less taxes. And so, hopefully, again, these are short-term issues that will grow back, but these are the kinds of things that we look at from a state standpoint when it comes to the types of investments we can make to keep addressing freight bottlenecks, to keep expanding our capacity in order to allow freight to flow. Looking at things like this and seeing the impacts of COVID as it relates to this is something that we do pay attention to, and something that hopefully will be, again, a shorter term decrease that won't impact the long-term strategies for our state. Scott, if you want to flip to the next slide. So, one thing, people aren't driving as much, but they're still buying in many ways. I mean, e-commerce is one of the big parts of the economy right now, as people are still buying but not traveling as far. And so e-commerce growth has been going on for several years, but it's actually dramatically increased in these recent months as things have shut down and people aren't able to travel. The official Census Bureau numbers for the first quarter show almost a 15% increase in e-commerce over the quarter of last year. But as the first quarter doesn't capture the full context of this, as it only goes through March. And so if you look at some other data that we found from Adobe's Digital Economy Index, that at U.S. e-commerce daily sales are up 50%, in April over the time in March, and online grocery sales, 110% increase. So not surprisingly, a dramatic increase in online commerce as people are still trying to make purchases but aren't traveling as much, or they're trying to be safe about it. This circle chart to the left is a survey from True Rating. They do consumer surveys for businesses at point of sale. And they did a recent survey that I thought was interesting that about, what sort of behavior would customers expect to see after these restrictions are over. And nearly 40% of those said that they'll shop online even more often than they're doing now, even after restrictions have eased. So, online, online commerce is there. It's been growing. It's something that businesses will have to take advantage of and continue to understand how to meet customers. And there's obviously a big logistics and supply chain component to help businesses meet those needs. And so the last slide, if you want to skip, Scott, just a couple of last minute things, and then I look forward to everybody's questions and further conversation. But just a couple of future trends and things that we're seeing out there. Again, some of this depends on how temporary or permanent a lot of these changes are that are driven by the COVID changes. And, one, industrial warehousing demand is still high, as we talked about e-commerce and also food distribution. I talked to the folks in our global commerce division, which are the ones of the Department of Economic Development who are actually out working to meet with businesses that are looking to locate and the ones that are trying to decide if they want to come to Georgia or expand. And they're seeing still a very strong demand for industrial warehousing. And so some of for the e-commerce side and also in food distribution. So some of that is down from a retail side, but it's still seen as high on that side as well. So those are things that continue to increase. A big thing that is coming out of this also is an increased emphasis on using data to help make decisions. So that's something that has been a big part of the supply chain story for a while now, but it's becoming even more clear that companies need to be able to have data insight onto their operations, into their supply chains, to be able to address challenges, predict issues, be able to make quicker insights and changes if they need to based on disruptions and things like that. And so that's something that will continue to be an increasing component of supply chain strategies for companies going forward. I saw a recent research from an IT research firm, ABI, research that said that global manufacturers are expected to increase their spending on data analytics, whether it's software or sensor data, things like that, from about 5 billion up to about 20 billion by 2026. So a major increase in investments in those strategies over the next few years as companies need to understand their ability to access that data to make decisions. Again, investments in omni-channel strategies, this idea with e-commerce and the need to be able to meet your customers in ways that you weren't able to do that before drives a lot of retail strategies going forward, which will again have a major impact on supply chains and people's decision making on how they source, how they provide supplies. The grocery delivery is a good example of that. There's been a look at a move towards improving the opportunities for people to order their groceries online and go pick up at store, or online grocery delivery, and those kinds of things have really increased in that perspective. And so, and other companies are finding success and making sure they're able to still maintain those customer interactions and sales even in times where they may not be able to do it in person. So customers and retail really looking on how they can make that work. And then lastly, just kind of the overall discussion about broadening and diversifying the supply chain. This look at, these conversations were going on, before this started, with the trade disputes with China and how that impacted people's ability to get their goods sourced from there. And so this look at how do companies, broaden that look so they're not relying on just a few suppliers and maybe they have more suppliers opportunities. Maybe it's bringing some of that back to the United States, or maybe it's looking at some additional options overseas, but really just broadening that supply chain. And again, there have been a lot of move towards a just-in-time delivery system where they didn't have a lot of inventory, and so rethinking inventory strategies and how are you able to maintain supplies so you can meet your customers' needs. You can get the materials that you need in order to produce your goods and in order to meet the needs that your customers have. So again, so those are just a few things. I appreciate again the opportunity to speak. I look forward to hearing from John and Ed, and happy to answer questions as we go along.
Well, thank you, Matt. You brought up something. John and I actually talked about this the other day. We've never looked at Forsyth County being a target for distribution. I mean, 400 doesn't go very much further up to Dawson County, then it just kind of ends in the mountains. We don't have a rail through Forsyth. We don't have an airport, but we have, even through COVID-19, we have had some inquiries about last mile distribution, and that was kind of a new phenomenon for us. I mean, we understand it from an applicable standpoint, but we never really thought that we would be a hub. But ultimately, it's that being driven by the amount of the households. So, all right, well, John, do you mind bringing your video up?
Okay.
John is. I apologize, Matt. I was so eager to get going, and having the issues with the screen, I didn't introduce you properly. So my apologies to that. But John is the director of the Business Development International Marketing for the Georgia Ports Authority. He lives in one of my favorite places in the whole state, Richmond Hill, or around the Richmond Hill area. Is that right?
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
About 20 minutes outside Savannah.
I love Savannah. To me, one of the most beautiful cities on the East Coast. Thank you, John.
All right, I appreciate it. The pictures I'm seeing right now are frozen. So if you just move, Scott, if you could just put the cover page up for mine, and I'll take your word that it's up there.
Yes, sir.
And I just want to say good afternoon to everybody, and I want to thank Scott and the Chamber for the opportunity to have Georgia Ports Authority participate in this call. I work very closely with a colleague of mine named Stacy Watson, and Stacy is our Director of Industrial and Economic Development. Stacy's, I think, triple booked today on a lot of WebExes, so I'm pinch hitting for him, so I'll do the best I can. Before I get into the slides, just a little bit about Georgia Ports Authority. I've been there almost 14 years. We operate deep water ports in Savannah. We have two in Savannah. One is called our Ocean Terminal, where we handle what we call roll-on, roll-off cargo, automobiles, high and heavy cargo like Caterpillar equipment, JCB equipment, John Deere, things like that. And then we also, just upriver a little bit in Garden City, is our Garden City Container Terminal. The Garden City Container Terminal is actually the largest container terminal in all of North America. It's over 1,300 acres. We're what's referred to as an operating port authority. And what that means is we own the land, but we also operate the terminal. Our crane operators in Savannah, they're all Georgia Ports Authority employees. In the ports like New York, New Jersey, and Los Angeles and Long Beach, they're what's referred to as landlord port authorities. So they own the property, but they lease the day-to-day operation out to the different terminal operators, different stevedores. It's a very, very different business model. For us, it gives us a lot of incentive to invest for the long term. We've got about 1,300 employees. Revenue is about $450 million a year, and we generate our revenue from the shipping line. So when the ships come in and they load and unload cargo and containers, they pay a certain price, a contractual price to us, and that's what we use for our operating income. Fortunately, we've got a strong balance sheet. Of that revenue split, about 90% of it these days is coming from the container business. So when you're riding down the highway and you see those 40 and 45-foot shipping containers or 20-foot shipping containers that are coming through the port, that's really where the bulk of the revenue comes from. Let's see. We rank in terms of container volume. I think this surprises a lot of people that sleepy little old Savannah is the third busiest port for containers in the U.S. The ports of Los Angeles and Long Beach out in California and New York, New Jersey up in the Northeast, who serve a very large population area, They're numbers 1 and number 2, and SAVANNAH is number 3. And we measure our container volume in a unit called 20-foot equivalent units, which I apologize, many of you probably know this, but I really don't like to use acronyms unless I explain them. And we found that helps. So a TEU, or 20-foot equivalent unit, we moved about 4.5 million of those last year. The other thing that's interesting about SAVANNAH is we have both the Norfolk Southern and the CSX Railroad on our terminal, and they have daily trains in and out of there. I was speaking with Ed earlier today. We're still handling about 11,000 trucks coming in and out of our facility every day. I also failed to mention we do have an inland port up in northwest Georgia in Murray County, and we're looking at other parts of the state for inland ports as well. But about 20% of our cargo today moves by rail. The other 80% is coming in and out by truck. That's a quick overview for Georgia ports. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the COVID-19 coronavirus and how that's impacted us. Talk a little bit about before, a little bit how we're doing now, and how we'll do and what we plan to do in the future. So, prior to COVID becoming the global pandemic that it was, the Port Authority was on track for another record year, particularly on the container side. Matt had mentioned the tariffs with China. They hit us pretty hard in 2019 at the end of the year, 2018 a little bit, but we had pretty much moved past, and our volumes were continuing to grow. So we were humming along pretty good, just like the U.S. economy was. Record low unemployment, stock market at record highs. The shipping lines, who are our big customers, they were all making money, so they were pretty happy. They were looking at expansions, and then when COVID hit, that pretty much changed all that. But before it hit, our primary importers were the retailers, the brick and mortar stores, and Matt mentioned e-commerce and omni-channel. We do very well in the Port of Savannah with the big box customers. Your Home Depots, your Lowe's, your Targets, your Walmarts. Those have all been big customers of ours for many years on the import side. We also import a lot of wearing apparel, footwear, furniture, and something we refer to as white goods. That's refrigerators, washers and dryers, things like that. Hardwares and housewares, they're a big part of our business. But what a lot of people don't realize is auto parts going to the OEMs is a huge part of our business. When the state of Georgia invested in the Kia plant over in West Point, that opened up a lot of new opportunities for us to import some parts, and also some of the suppliers established offices in Georgia. So that was a big part for us as well. Construction equipment, tires, all those things were very, very heavy movers for us on the inbound side. And on the export side, as you might guess, frozen poultry is a big commodity for us to export globally. Along with that, anything that comes from a Georgia pine tree, any forest products, craft liner board, paper board, wood pulp, logs and lumber, and another commodity that's kind of unique to Georgia, middle Georgia, is kaolin clay. We also export a lot of peanuts, a lot of cotton, a lot of chemicals. So that's it on our export side of things. On the non-containerized part, we move finished automobiles into and out of Savannah and also in Brunswick. Brunswick has, by land, by size, it's about the biggest non-container roll-on, roll-off port in the country. It's not the highest volume yet, but we have the room to grow. Where places like Jacksonville and Baltimore, who are a little bit ahead of us, they really are landlocked. They really don't have the room to grow. Let's see. So let's fast forward. Scott, if you could just put up that slide that has a lot of the headlines.
Yes, sir.
All right. Once COVID hits China, what happens then? We have the Chinese New Year. So every year, Chinese New Year fluctuates by a few days or a couple of weeks. So this past year, January 25th was the date of Chinese New Year. every year around Chinese New Year, shipments from Asia in particular, they tend to accelerate prior to the Chinese New Year, and then they slow down during Chinese New Year. It usually takes a couple weeks for it to ramp back up. So our annual shipments to and from China, we're going along pretty well. And right around the same time as Chinese New Year, that's when they started to announce some of the COVID cases in China, in Wuhan. That really hit us hard. We went from as it hit China. China went into a lockdown, as we know. That kept a lot of the workers from returning to the coastal cities where most of the manufacturing is done. Factories in China didn't open, so the post-Lunar New Year factory startups was significantly delayed. That led to a supply problem for a lot of our companies in the U.S., a lot of our employees, whether they were on the retail side or whether they were manufacturers waiting for containers of parts to come in to do the assembly in the U.S. So that hit us pretty hard. The frozen poultry shipments that were on their way to China, they basically got to China, they took them off a ship, but there were no truck drivers in China to deliver, whether it was food or any other products to where they needed to go. It could have been raw materials going from the U.S. to manufacturing facilities in China. All that really got hung up on the docks in China. You think about poultry and refrigerated containers. There's only so many places that you can plug those containers in on a port before you run out of space. So it created a lot of challenges over in China, which led to backups on the U.S. side for the folks that were processing chicken and things like that. So that was a big issue. On the import side to the U.S., as China was unable to ship to us because of the lockdown, there was a dual effect. Not only were importers not getting their cargo, but that turned into an equipment problem because all our exporters need empty containers to load their merchandise going back to China. So the U.S. manufacturers who source parts, really had problems. Our forest product folks, our kaolin and clay folks, the cotton, all that was challenged getting over to China because the equipment was not available. My background prior to coming to the port was working for a global shipping company called Maersk Line. So as I put on my container shipping hat, so as the COVID spread globally and it started hitting us here, obviously we know non-essential workers were ordered to shelter at home. As non-essential businesses are ordered to close, unemployment numbers started going up. I think everybody on this phone call or Blue Jeans meeting knows transportation workers, including folks at the port, the railroads, the truckers, were deemed essential, and we were able to continue to work. So fortunately, we kept going. We kept the ports open. I won't say business as usual because we had to put a lot of safety procedures enacted for both the shoreside workers and then the vessel crews coming in from other countries. In the U.S., the container shipping business, the majority of the imports are coming from Asia, and the majority of those coming from Asia are actually coming from China. So you can see how it would be almost a perfect storm there. But we're open for business. Some of our administrative staff has been working from home. Whoever we could allow to work from home, we encourage that, and we're still doing some of that. One of my teams that works with me is our customer service team. About half a year ago, we switched our phone system to a web-based system, and that allowed us, when coronavirus hit, to allow our customer service reps to work from home. As long as they had an internet connection and a computer, they were able to do business as usual. Get the phone calls coming in from our customers, handle about almost 1,000 emails a day. So by having that flexibility to work from home, it was great. Our IT team stepped up and helped us with that. If you could, Scott, if you could go to the next slide. There'll be a whole bunch of headlines on this slide. So if you can see them, I'm going to just, talk about what's going on in Wuhan and what's going on in the world. And one of the companies you'll see on here, it says Maersk warns of lower earnings from coronavirus. And Maersk Line is a shipping company I worked for 18 years. And what's important about that is these shipping companies, they are very capital intensive, and they typically build ships, years out before they're needed. So they have a lot of debt. Just about every major shipping company was feeling the strain. So a lot of them have gone out for loans from their governments, from their national governments, or lines of credit so they can continue to operate. But, by and large, it hit pretty much everybody. Let's see. On the container shipping side, then we got into a demand issue, right? Once we had layoffs and furloughs in the U.S., people weren't going out and buying. The stores were closed, first of all, so you couldn't run over to Kohl's and buy something off the rack. But if they had a good e-commerce platform, you're taking advantage of those e-commerce platforms. What did this do to the container lines? Well, the container lines, they saw their bookings or their book of business or reservations, if you will, they dropped significantly from the importers. In fact, a lot of the importers actually canceled orders from the manufacturers overseas, which kind of put them in a tough spot. So when the demand for the space on the ships drops, you get into a supply-demand equation, and that's typically when the freight rates that the shipping lines charge, they take a downward spiral. So what the shipping lines did was they took a lot of ships out of service, similar to what the airlines did. The airlines cancel flights and put the planes out in the desert somewhere. On the shipping side, they canceled a lot of sailings or voyages. They anchored the ships over in Asia, and just really they wanted to try to keep that demand up for space as much as they could, because they knew if they kept the demand up for the space, they could keep the rates at a relatively stable level. But again, when you do that, that impacts the supply chain for everybody. The exporters got hit with that. The importers got hit with that. As a terminal operator, it meant a lot of times containers were sitting on our terminal, particularly on the export side, longer than normal. So one of the things we did was we reached out to the shipping lines and a lot of the exporters. We said, if you need extra time on our port, we can help you out with that. It's not your fault that the shipping lines are canceling because there's not enough cargo there. There's not enough demand. So we help the folks out when it comes to that. As far as our customers go, a lot of the brick and mortar guys were having trouble, but a lot of these guys that are on the omni-channel side, your Home Depots, your big box stores, really did well. And the other segment of the market we saw do really well were the dollar stores. Your Dollar Generals, your Family Dollars, your Dollar Trees. They all did really, really well. You can, if you're following Wall Street, you can see how their results have been for the last couple months or so. So, pandemic had a serious impact throughout the supply chain. Though I think on the manufacturing side, you folks probably know better than I do what the shortage of parts have meant to you. And where does that take us, kind of going forward? What do we expect in the future? One of the things we expect is, one of the things we learned from is the need for good communications. When we were working with our importers, our exporters, our employees, Customs and Border Protection, the steamship lines, the trucking companies, the railroads, it was really important that we got our word out, whether it's through email blast and constant contact or updating our website to really what's going on around the port. We've adjusted our hours of operation a little bit. We've cut back on our overtime for our staff, but we really think long term. We have a long term 10-year plan that we work on. We just finished up our Focus 2030 plan just prior to coronavirus breaking out. A lot of those things remain relative today. Increasing our capacity at the port is still really important. On the importer side, we'll see long-time customers facing the financial stress. We know some of them aren't going to make it, but some of them will. Matt talked about e-commerce, and that's really going to continue to grow, whether it's picking up your groceries, and Scott talked about last mile. I think that there's going to be a lot of opportunities in there for last mile. Kind of wrapping it up. the brick and mortar guys, they're not going to go away completely, but some of those longtime names, are really, really going to struggle. Our Pier 1s and J.C. Penney's, who for years have been big customers of the port, they're facing some really tough times. But Georgia Ports, we're an engine, not just for Savannah and for Georgia, but for the whole Southeast region. And, we take that seriously. We've got a great team that I work with. We've got a great board of directors. We do have a really strong balance sheet, and that's going to be helpful. And we're blessed to have incredible support from our elected officials in D.C., on a state level, and on the local level. So we appreciate you letting those folks know and supporting the port as well. We're extremely grateful for that. Georgia Ports will continue to invest for the long term. Our CapEx program for this year is a little over $200 million. We're continuing to grow. We know we'll get through this, and as we do, we're going to need that extra capacity. And I guess just the last slide, Scott, is just really I wanted to say thank you to everybody for giving us the opportunity to speak. If there's questions after Ed speaks, I'm happy to try to answer them. So thank you very much.
Thank you, John. We really appreciate that.
Sure.
A lot of people don't realize just what a big economic engine the Georgia Ports is to our state.
Thanks.
Okay. Ed, if you don't mind bringing up your video.
Yeah, go ahead. I know we're getting a little tight for time.
Yeah.
If you want to move on to that first one, might as well start with the silver lining.
Okay.
So if you can move to that next slide there.
Sure. Well, let me introduce Ed Crowell, President and CEO of the Georgia Motor Trucking Association. Ed's been in the role since 1993. Port would be of absolute no use if we didn't be able to get those containers to the last final destination. So thank you, Ed, for joining us today.
Glad to do so. So just a little bit about what we've got here, just a few slides, folks. To give you some idea, we did some surveying of trucking companies. I would echo what Matt and John have said about the fact that, the size and the need of logistics here in the state of Georgia, the role that it plays. And going back to Matt's earlier slides, when you saw the 360,000 employees, well, trucking is about 340,000 of those. So we're sort of the heart and soul of everything logistics related. But I just want to share with you some interesting things from the impact of all these shutdowns and the changing supply lines. If you'll see here, the number of respondents, we did some surveys with the American Transportation Research Institute, which is probably the premier researcher of trucking and transportation in the country. They do a lot of work, especially with the industry, and they were a great help with this. Scott, go ahead and go on to the next slide. One of the things that's near and dear to our heart here in Atlanta is what shows on this next slide, the change that the shutdowns had on traffic. If you look to the left, you'll see the average speed in the Atlanta area, especially around Spaghetti Junction, and you'll notice that at times, for instance, in Atlanta for a truck, the average speed could be as low as 10 and 12 miles an hour, which has a real impact on delivery times. And you'll see the third week of March, which was right after the big shutdowns here and elsewhere in the country. You'll notice the average speed in Atlanta came pretty close to 60 miles an hour, pretty much nonstop through Spaghetti Junction. For some in the trucking industry, that was a golden age, a golden moment where trucks could finally get where they needed to get. But you see that impact was elsewhere too. You see the New York there as well. And those are real-time numbers. One of the things American Transportation Research Institute does is aggregate the data from the GPS movement of vehicles, from the trucks. So those are records of basically 250,000 trucks are watched not quite real-time, and all the data is aggregated to gauge movements through the system. So huge impact for having cars basically shut down and leaving the road systems more open. Go ahead and move on, Scott, if you would. Okay, and this is just another look, and I've got a few of them here, of the actual impact. Most of this is dated late March to early April. And you can see that the impacts of the shutdowns were quick. You can see the different industries that had spread across there. Those of you who use truckload carriers, those involved in the LTLs, specialized carriers, which would be the heavy rigging folk and the crane operators, they took it harder than everyone else because the projects they worked on just were all shut down. And you can see what went on there. We saw a huge spike, as everyone knows, in the produce side, on the food carrier side. And I didn't include the slide today, but I have one that shows that the incredible change the industry went through. Prior to about the third week of March, 60% of the food that was delivered in this country was going to restaurants for people to consume out of home, and about 40% was going to grocery stores that would end up on plate at home. In the space of a week, that did a complete 180. And 65% of all the food being hauled was going to grocery stores so that people could buy it and take it home. And below 30% was then going to restaurants, which were, of course, for the most part, effectively shut down. That rippled through the supply chain everywhere, including in Georgia's poultry industry. A lot of folk have gotten a lot of education in supply chain in the last few months. One of the things a lot of people didn't realize is that the cuts of meat, the cuts of chicken, fish, everything else that's done for restaurant consumption is different and runs through different systems than what is usually in the grocery store for you to take home. So some kinks in the supply chain that came along were switching over to package things properly for those home deliveries. Scott, you can move on if you would.
Okay.
And here's just a look at the different size trucking companies and their expectations, their impacts. As you can see, the smaller trucking companies really got slammed. The larger guys took a little less of the hit, and some of that has to do with the customers they were serving. We saw in the industry a lot of shippers, a lot of factories, a lot of folk hang on and close out that first quarter, not make changes until the end of March, which as an industry was helpful because it gave us some lead time. People were being told, the factory's still going full tilt, but we're going to close down the 1st of April, and or we're going to cut our production the 1st of April. And we saw that come through the economy, and it had an impact on trucking. We held on a little better, but then trucking went through its own dip in employment and utility into early to mid-April and into May. Scott, if you'll move on too.
Okay.
I'm trying to make sure we have some time left. So overall, another impact that seems weird, but you may think with no cars on the road, there should have been more parking, but in fact, truck stops, rest stops were closed down as well. And so one of the problems that came up were twofold. One on the road side. Some states went so far as to close down truck stops, which was just one of those shoot yourself in the foot sort of things that quickly most states figured out was not a good idea, that you had to keep them open for the drivers that had to be driving to deliver all these essential goods. A real issue for us was that a lot of shippers made life much more difficult for truckers, not always intentionally, but in imposing their own health and safety recommendations, their own systems. We had drivers who were not allowed, for instance, into drivers' lounges any longer, told to use an outhouse, or not an outhouse, but a porta-john, or told to find facilities somewhere else to clean up. All of that just put kinks in the supply chain, and of course, obviously we don't want to see people treated that way. But in addition, some shippers had drivers fill out questionnaires of their personal health and where they had delivered before they came there. All of that added up to increases in detention throughout the system and slowing of the supply chain. Again, right when it was most necessary for us to be able to be flexible and to be able to respond quickly. Scott, you can go on.
Okay.
And I think this is close to the end here, but one of the things we did ask was what we expected in the next few months. And again, this data is about a month old. So what you've got here is actually changed. But you can see slightly less than half thought things would be about the same or improved. There was still a trending idea that things were going to get worse. I'm happy to tell you that in the last couple of weeks that has changed. Truck traffic has picked up. I think Matt mentioned that, and business has picked up. A lot of areas that were not seeing business are starting to see them again. Factories are coming back online, and the industries out there are moving. We did a trucker appreciation event just up at the Ringgold Scales yesterday, and in less than 2 hours we were able to hand out 200 lunches to trucks coming through, and we didn't get all of them, but the streets are full, the roads are full with trucks and freight, and of course that means business is moving along. So I take that as a great sign that we're starting the recovery and starting the comeback. Scott, I think if there's one more, we'll do that. If not, I think that might be it. There you go.
I think
Thank
that's
you.
it. All right. Thank you, Ed. John, Matt, we appreciate you participating. All right, so if everybody will look up in the top right-hand corner, we've got some questions that we want to ask. If you have any questions, go ahead and put those in, and I'll read them out to the group. First up, guys, there's a question here. Has imports from China decreased?
Okay. Well, I would say yes, they have decreased, and what I failed to mention in my talk, and I did have some notes on it, goes to that second part of that question about new sourcing channels. I think a lot of things changed with China as a result of, even prior to coronavirus, the tariffs and the trade war, right? So global supply chains, you got to be diversified. You have to have backups. So places like Vietnam start to pick up, but Vietnam does not have 1.4 million people, and they don't have the infrastructure that China has. But places like Vietnam, places like India, places like Indonesia and Thailand, those are some of the areas that people are looking at as far as diversifying their supply chain. I didn't really talk about reshoring and nearshoring and things like that. I think, that some of the I guess, less expensive items, it's going to be difficult to bring some of those really low labor cost things to back to the U.S., right? But the advanced manufacturing, I think we see a lot of that coming back to the U.S. or near the U.S. I think everybody's supply chain is under a microscope these days, particularly if they were only focused on China. Hopefully that helps.
Matt, this may be one specifically for you. Are new sourcing channels needed?
Well, I think that, it's kind of my final point about kind of broadening the supply chain and looking at new opportunities for that. I think, companies have been seeing before this, and, this crisis is sort of put into perspective the need to make sure you're a little bit more diverse in the way that you source materials and supplies as you work. And so, obviously the state of Georgia, would love to have all the manufacturing, move back here, and we improve the number of companies here locally that are supplying those materials. That's not going to happen overnight or need. But I do think that, companies longer term would benefit from thinking about, how can you have redundancy in your supply chain in some ways, or the ability to source more. If there's a second wave, third wave, or whatever of this, in short term. But if you look at what was going on already with concerns with China and what may go internationally in other parts of the world in a different way, just being able to not rely on one import, I think is a good strategy.
Gotcha. Feel free, John and Ed, if you want to jump in. Lastly, how are job opportunities looking at the moment, especially for college grads in the supply chain?
I'll touch on that just briefly. I think in the short term, in the immediate term, it's a little bit hard to tell because we're still kind of in the middle of this in terms of job loss and things like that. But we were actually, before this started, looking at logistics education and employment in Georgia and looking at kind of what the future looked like for that. And we really did see that there was a very large need for jobs in Georgia, from everything from the warehousing side and the necessarily not formal education all the way up through a formal education. I mean, we saw that there's several really good programs for logistics and supply chain in Georgia, and there aren't as many graduates as there are job openings, or at least, again, this was kind of pre-COVID. And so, a logistics or supply chain career for college graduates has been seen as a very potentially good long-term career choice. And so it's been something we had been promoting. Again, with the short-term things going on now, we hope that results. And if you look at some ways, it's still strong. If you're, Amazon or Walmart, I mean, these companies are still hiring like crazy to try to meet immediate needs, where obviously on other sides they're not. So, I think overall, long-term, the way we've been looking is that especially in Georgia, that there was a really good career opportunities in supply chain.
Got it. Here comes one. What COVID impacts have you seen in respect to the drayage carriers servicing the Southeast ports?
This is John. I'll tackle that one at first, and then Ed, you may want to chime in too. But
well, actually, real quick, John, gentlemen, I'm going to have to say goodbye.
Okay.
I've got to get on this other next meeting. So,
Lincoln, Kentucky.
I wish you all the best, and it's been great to talk with you.
Thank you, Ed, for participating.
thanks, Ed.
Take care.
Okay. All right. So on the drayage side, we're still pretty strong. We're doing over 11,000 truck transactions a day. Prior to COVID, we were doing over 12,000 a day. From the truck driver standpoint, we make sure we have the proper, PPE when they're coming in. There's a lot of deep cleaning going on at the entrances to the port, at the pedestals where they have to check in. Having better restroom facilities on the terminal instead of just porta potties, having something better, because we know they've got to wash their hands a lot more. It was a little slow there for a little while, but I think we've picked back up. I'm not sure if there's a specific aspect of the drayage. One of the things we've done is, because the volumes are down a little bit, we've discontinued our Saturday gates. We used to have a Saturday gate from 8 a.m. to noon and then 1 to 5. And on those Saturdays, we were doing less than 2,000 container moves on a Saturday, compared with 12 to 11,000 Monday through Friday. So we've discontinued that, try and keep our costs down. I think we also reduced our start time. We used to start at 0600 in the morning. Now we're starting at 7 a.m. We're still closing up at 6. If drivers are in there, drivers tend to like to go in early in the morning, get as many runs as they can, and really by 4 o'clock, 4:30 in the afternoon, the gates are pretty empty. And I think that's just a factor of the drivers get so many turns earlier in the day. They shut it down themselves, or their distribution centers where they're taking the containers are shutting down. So I think that's really about the extent of the impact on the drivers.
Good. Well, that seems to be the last of our questions. Ed's had to go to another call. Matt, I appreciate you and I've been working together on some projects in the past, and so I appreciate our relationship. John, thank you for coming all the way up to Forsyth County and participating in our manufacturing society conversation here. You guys play the ultimate role in getting what we produce here to and from the markets. So I want to say thank you for everybody that participated today. Thanks for the sponsors who helped make this event available. And Someone asked about the slides. I will put these slides, I'll put them in a PDF and send them out to everybody that registered. So thank you all. Matt, John, again, bless you. Thank you. Appreciate it.
All right,
Thanks so
thank you,
much.
everyone.
Okay.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Take care.